Então.
Hello.
Y el tuyo.
Good afternoon,
So,
everybody.
My sound's messed up still.
Está viendo mucho.
All right, looks like YouTube is finally cooperating on the other screen. Hopefully that's going to be stable. All right, I think we're doing all right. At least I hope so. You can never quite tell with the technology, but it looks like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So good afternoon or evening to everyone. It's getting to be that time of year where it's a little hard to tell the difference between afternoon and night. We celebrated Purim last week, so that meant that we didn't have our class, but you may be then surprised to see that we are about to start another holiday. Welcome to the fun of Judaism in the springtime, where we go from Purim to exactly 1 month later, the celebration of Pesach. This is the end of the holiday cycle, Purim, and the beginning of the holiday cycle, Pesach, bumping up against one another. And as such, and especially since Pesach is a rather, shall we say, involved holiday, in many ways much more involved than Purim, I wanted to go ahead and make sure that we could begin studying about it to give everyone enough time to take in what we're talking about and be able to use it for their coming celebration. So we're going to start on Pesach this week, talking about the main theme of Pesach, as well as the signature event, the unique feature of Pesach called the Seder. And then next week, we'll talk more about the keeping Passover kosher for Passover, because even though we talked about keeping kosher quite recently, there are special rules when it comes to Passover, which we will briefly discuss tonight, but go into much more detail next week, along with a few other elements. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get down to the story. So why are we having Pesach at all? As always, the best place to go is to find answers is the Torah itself. As we'll see, the Torah needs a little explanation, but I think everyone can at least recognize the core elements from this verse, or this section taken from the book of Exodus, chapter 12. A little bit of the backstory. Remember that at this point, the Israelites are still slaves in the land of Egypt. There has been a year's worth of plagues going against the Egyptians, Pharaoh in particular, to try and get him to let us go. They have not yet, but we are on the eve of the final plague, the slaying of the firstborn, and that is going to be the setting of the first ever Passover Seder activity, the first ever gathering of our people to celebrate what would become called the holiday of Pesach, or Passover in English. So here's what the Torah says about that first night. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, that's the month that we now call Nisan, also known as next month in the Jewish calendar, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household, meaning that there would be a lamb that would be designated and set aside for that household. If there's too much meat on one lamb for a person or for one family, then you go into a cooperative. You collaborate with other families to share a lamb. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of this month, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts of the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. So the lambs are going to be slaughtered on the day before Passover. Remember, all Jewish holidays begin at night. And the blood from that lamb is going to be put on the doorposts. That's the side of each door, and the top of the door. That's what the lintel is. Not a word that we use a lot in English, let alone not expecting you to know the Hebrew. The houses, in the houses in which they are to eat it. Now, we know from the rest that this is also a way of marking a Jewish home, and especially important symbolically during this final plague of the slaying of the firstborn. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted. Heat head, legs, and entrails over the fire. So we get a number of very important points that are going to be informing the rest of our celebration. First is that there is the eating of the Passover sacrifice. Secondly is that it's going to be roasted over a fire. Thirdly, that this is being eaten with unleavened bread, what we call matzah. Just as a quick FYI, although we'll talk about this in much more detail to come, leavening is the process in which bread rises, in which it gets fluffy and airy. This is bread that has not been given the time to rise. Like I said, we usually call it matzah in English, even still, because the word unleavened bread just doesn't, it's not something that we use as a regular term. And with bitter herbs, or what are called maror. These bitter herbs, these plants that have a bitter taste, go along with the eating of the matzah and the Passover sacrifice. We already talked about eating it and how it's cooked. You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left over until morning, you shall burn it. So you take any leftovers that are there and they are destroyed because this is a sacred offering, the Passover offering of the ancient world, and it can only be eaten at this time. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, that means your clothes worn in such a way that you can get up and go at a moment's notice. You are prepared, you are ready. Sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord. So this is setting the stage for the feeling of the day. And the day is one of anticipation, and the day is one of preparedness, ready to leap on the opportunity for liberation from slavery the moment we can go, the moment we get that signal. And as such, you can see that this holiday celebration combines what would be a sort of meal of impressive family gathering with symbols that are going to be very important, the matzah and the bitter herbs, but most importantly, the feeling emotionally of being ready to leap to our feet once we get the signal from God that now is the time for freedom. So this is setting the stage for every Seder, every Passover that happens after that. Oh, where'd my mouse go? All right. Furthermore, we see in chapter 13, as part of the explanation of the holiday, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, matzah, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival of the Lord, meaning that there is a special festival at the beginning and a special festival at the end of the week. Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found with you, and no leaven shall be found in all of your territory. So the requirements regarding the leavening and the types of breads we're eating, as I said, we'll go into that in much more detail next week. Just a little bit of an FYI. As you can see, we are supposed to eat matzah, but Jewish law considers that eating to be something limited as a requirement to the first night, or here outside of Israel, on the first 2 nights. If you don't want to eat any matzah for the rest of the holiday, that's fine. You're not allowed to eat other types of leavened breads, no donuts, croissants, or just regular bread, but you're not obligated to eat a piece of matzah every day, only on the very first evening or 2 if you live outside of Israel. But now we get to the heart of the matter. It is because, and you shall explain to your son on that day, son meaning child, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. Notice the personalization and how we explain this to the child. And this shall serve you as a sign on your hand, as a reminder on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. You shall keep this institution at its set time from year to year. And so we have. And you can see, though, that there is an emotional and spiritual element to the Seder, which is not just the eating, it is not just the performance of a service, but that it is meant to be a psychological, emotional, spiritual, whatever way you want to describe it, touchstone that will continue to revive certain national and personal feeling of liberation and freedom during this moment. The Seder is meant to be a transformative experience, not merely a historical reenactment. It is not meant to be dry, pardon to the matzah. It is not meant to be stale, pardon to the matzah. It is meant to be ever fresh and feeling ever personal and alive. And as we go through how we do the Seder, how we engage with the mitzvot of Passover, that should be your main focus. And if at any point you're not quite sure how to implement it for any of the different things that we'll be discussing, please just ask a question and I will try to fill in with more detail. So that means that we have roughly 4 main mitzvot, 4 main commandments that are associated with the holiday. The first, as we saw very prominently, the Passover sacrifice itself, what is known as the Korban Pesach. This was the sacrifice of the lamb that was done in Egypt and then subsequently was done at the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then in the beginning, early days of Israel, and then done at the altar of Jerusalem in the temple itself. We do not have the Jerusalem altar anymore. It was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, and as such, we do not have the means to offer up a Passover sacrifice, which means, as you can see it crossed off, this is not a mitzvah for which we are obligated at the moment because there is no way to fulfill the Passover sacrifice. As a matter of fact, in many communities, people are even reluctant to eat a roast of lamb of any type for fear that someone might think that it was a substitute for that sacrifice. It's not technically prohibited unless you come from a family where they are avoiding it, but and you should keep that custom if so, but it is something that many communities frown upon, and that's why you'll find beef and chicken to be the more common meat staples for this night. The second mitzvah is the Passover ritual meal, what we call the Seder, literally the order, because it's an ordered service of a meal rather than just everybody sit around and chew. And this is where we have the retelling of the story in fulfillment of the passage we saw in the section from Exodus 13 that says to explain to your children what happened. As we also saw from chapter 12, we eat matzah and maror. We may not have the Pesach Korban, the sacrifice, but we do still have the unleavened bread, matzah, and we do still have maror, the bitter herbs. And we also remove chametz. We remove the leavened substances, food substances from our households, but more on that next time. So really tonight we're going to focus on those middle 2. The Passover Seder itself, the retelling of the story and how it is structured, along with a few details on the eating of matzah and maror. Any questions so far? All right. So the Seder, as we know it, that is to say, the specific structure and guide that we have for observing this evening meal that is paralleling the eating of the sacrifice along with the other elements, matzah, maror, and the retelling, this was established as a guide, as an assistance. Very, very technically, if we wanted to go back 2,500, 600, 700 years to the early days after we left Egypt, you might find that people would do this meal in many different ways while still hitting all the main elements. Over time, however, like any good material, the better explanations, the better insights, the better teachings, the better phrasings began to be shared more and more. And over time, it became a beautiful structure that would ensure that we would get through everything that needed to be done, that we would have all of the mitzvot taken care of, and that we would have the telling in a way that was understandable to multiple people. However, despite all of this, we have to understand that it is not a script. The Seder is not something, the Haggadah, the book itself, is not something that we simply open up to page 1 and begin reading and finish up at the end of the Haggadah and think that we have done our Passover service. It is a guidebook. The same way that if you were going to visit a foreign city and you had a guidebook for that city, reading through the book and just walking around the streets with the book, you could technically say you visited the city, but if you never pick up your nose from the book and look at where you are and reflect on it from your own personal point of view while you're there in that place, really, you have not done your full duty of exploring that moment. And the Seder should be explored in our personal reflections as we go through the Haggadah. It is not meant to merely be recited. And as you'll see as we go through, it really is designed to trigger our own reflections and ideas and feelings more than just to be read as a static book. However, it definitely is helpful that the Seder, the order of the Haggadah, is laid out in a way that prevents us from missing any of the essential elements of that meal. And that structure means that we are more likely to have those experiences. This is something I try to explain to anyone who is engaging with Judaism in a deeper way, that yes, we have lots of books, and yes, we have lots of words, and yes, our services can even feel a little long, and sometimes even a little over-orchestrated or structured. Do not look at it as being a straitjacket. Look at it as being a personalized guide to the experiences you are trying to have. It is not a replacement for you, but instead it is a guide helping you to fulfill and maximize those experiences. So these different steps are there in a way that, left to our own devices, most of us would never be able to either remember them all, or more importantly, be able to feel the depth of the insights that they give us. So you are a partner with this guidebook. It is not replacing you, and you cannot replace it. So here are the steps. Kadesh, which is the recital of Kiddush, the blessing and drinking of the first cup of wine. Urchatz, the first washing of the hands, this time purely for hygiene. Karpas, the dipping of karpas, which we'll talk about what that is in a minute, in salt water. Yachatz, the breaking of the middle matzah, the larger piece of which becomes hidden for the afikomen. All of these terms will be explained. The magid, which is the largest portion of the time that we spend, which is the retelling of the Passover story, and also includes the drinking of the second cup of wine. Urchatz, the second washing of the hands, this time as an act of ritual purification. Motzi matzah, the blessing before eating the matzah. Maror, the blessing and eating of the maror. Koreich, the eating of a sandwich made from matzah and maror as a symbolic reminder of the Passover offering. Shulchan orech, the actual holiday meal, the dinner itself, the main course, if you will. Safun, the eating of the afikomen. Barech, the blessing after the meal and the drinking of the third cup of wine. Hallel, the recital of the Hallel, which is a set of songs, as we'll see, the drinking of the fourth cup of wine, and Mirtzah, the formal conclusion to the evening's meal. Sounds like a lot, but we're going to go through each one piece by piece, and hopefully you'll understand that each one has a very special moment to share with us.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is it okay if we create our own Haggadah for the family that includes all of those steps that you just mentioned? Or should we not do that as much?
Yes, that is to say that the Haggadah that we have now, the book that you will find most commonly published and the contents of which you'll find most commonly published, is the most popular Ashkenazic version that fulfills all of these elements. However, when you look in other cultures and other places around the world, you will find variation. And when you look back historically, you will see that the Haggadah is a book that has been edited and re-edited and altered over the last couple thousands of years that we have records from. And it's constantly been changing and evolving. And we'll look at a few examples in our discussions tonight. So if there are elements that you would like to add to and like to interpret, by all means, either write your own version of it or produce it and share it verbally with the people at your table. But if it's helpful to put together your own Haggadah, well, we are blessed to live in a modern world where we have computers and technology that lets everybody do that for themselves. You can find the basic text for the Haggadah at sefaria.org. It also has many commentaries on the Haggadah if you're looking for additional insights, which will take you into much greater depth than we can do here tonight. And you can cut and paste from there into your own Word documents and be able to create a personalized Haggadah. I've done that for my family, and we use that most years. And it definitely allows for a little bit more feeling of freedom and flexibility. And that's something that really I cannot repeat enough. I've mentioned in other classes and other topics about the prayers in Sidurim, but our prayers were not meant to be locked in a final shape by the printing of the prayer book. The printing press was meant to make the information more available. It was not meant to make it dead and buried. The Siddur and the Haggadah are not meant to be kept in a museum. They are meant to be living documents. We definitely do not want to eliminate the essential elements, and we'll talk about what those are as we go through. But certainly interpreting and including the essential while adding personal is exactly what the Haggadah is meant to help us achieve. So don't be a slave to the printing press. By all means, continue to adapt and apply your own personal insights to your own set, to your own Seder table. As a little bit of a heads up, since you guys are the first who are going to be hearing about this publicly, since we're not having an in-person Seder this year as part of Temple Israel celebration, we are going to put together a selection of little video vignettes that go through the different elements of the Seder, but also share different pieces of congregants' wisdom and experiences and stories for the different parts of the Seder. So absolutely, we should celebrate family traditions. We should celebrate individual insights. And if it's easier for you to include that in your Haggadah, by all means. If you want to create a supplement for your Haggadah, that's great too. And really, when you're just at the Seder, there should still be new things that didn't even make it into the book. The Seder should never be only what is on the page.
Joshua,
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. One thing you might want to do with the kids is Haggadot were always illustrated. And they could like illustrate around the corners and, use it as a coloring tool and then put your own text in the middle.
Absolutely. Right. And that's not just for kids. Adults are also encouraged to do art in their Haggadah. We can't draw on the day of the holiday, but in advance, Haggadot were often illustrated, and some of the most beautiful Jewish art, especially from the Middle Ages, comes from the illuminated manuscripts of Haggadot. So art is one more form of expression that has a place at our Seder table. Absolutely. If anyone ever wants to discuss the history of how people came to think that once a prayer book or Haggadah was printed that you couldn't touch it, I'll be more than happy to talk about that another time. But we've got a whole Seder to run through, and we've only got about half an hour left to go. So Kadesh, like I said, is the celebration that's done over a cup of wine, where we formally declare the sanctity of the day. It emphasizes the joy of the holidays in general, and every time we have a biblical holiday, Kadesh, we also do a special reference to the theme of the holiday. So with regards to Pesach, it is Man Chirutenu, it is the time of our liberation, of our freedom. And that gives you a very big clue right at the beginning of what the theme should be. Now, unique to Passover, unlike the other holidays, is that we will drink formally, officially, 4 cups of wine throughout the evening service. These do not need to be large. They can be just a few ounces if that is better for you and your constitution. They can be watered down, so they don't have to be full strength. And indeed, all wine was watered down in the ancient world. That's just how they made it. And you can even use kosher for Passover grape juice to fulfill the mitzvah as well. If you cannot stomach the wine, or if you have other reasons to avoid alcohol. So there are 4 cups that are drunk officially. You can have additional, especially if you're not driving, during the meal or part of the Seder, but there are 4 official cups of wine that are drunk. Now, these 4 cups of wine parallel the 4 promises of redemption from Exodus chapter 6. As we can see here, and I've underlined and even put a little number on it, say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring, right? I will bring, it's a promise, you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. So as we celebrate the fulfillment of these 4 different promises, we mark each of them with one of the cups of wine. We move on from that declaration of sanctity to practical matters. The first is Urchatz, which is the washing of our hands. We do not say a blessing here because we are not doing something that is a mitzvah in the formal sense of the word. There is no commandment to wash our hands. However, our ancestors have known for a very long time that washing your hands before eating was very, very healthy. It was a good idea. And this is something that we want to make sure that we have not overlooked, because we are about to eat the first thing on the table. And that is the karpas, where we say a special blessing over what we are eating. Now, it is a vegetable that comes from the earth. That means it grows from the ground in a non-renewable plant, one that you'll have to plant again each year. And the most common plant that people use in the US customs is parsley. Of course, since we are now eating, we have to say a blessing over that food. And we say the blessing of Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pari ha'adamah, the one who created the fruit of the earth. And then we dip it in the salt water and we eat it. The salt water is often considered to be representative of both the sweat and the tears from our toil and the suffering of slavery, but it is also a way of beginning a meal. This is not an uncommon way to start a meal in the ancient Greco-Roman society, and it was a way of whetting the appetite, of making you hungrier later on. The sages were very clear that one should eat Passover, and especially the matzah, with enthusiasm. As much as matzah is not everybody's favorite food, some people really love it, but most do not. We should look upon it as being an amazing gift that God gave us because of what it represents. And in order to make sure our stomachs are really ready to go and our mouth is watering, having this appetizer at the beginning gets us in the proper mood. That is followed by Yachatz, which is the breaking of the middle matzah. So we take 3 matzahs on Passover, and we break the middle one, and we set that aside for the afikomen. Now, there are many different traditions about the 3 matzahs. You'll often hear them referred to as the Kohen, the Levites, and the Israelites, the 3 different segments of the Jewish people at that time. But looking into the history of the matter, there's actually a more practical reason. On Shabbat and other holidays, you'll know that we have 2 loaves of bread in order to remember the double portion of manna that God gave us, so we wouldn't have to go out on Shabbat or holidays to gather. In the ancient world, you would only have 2 on Passover as well, and you would break one. But by breaking one, you would now be physically reducing your enjoyment by removing it from that site. And many communities developed a custom of adding an additional whole loaf, meaning sheet of matzah, in order to make sure that we started off with 2 full loaves plus the one that would be reduced to half. In either case, we are looking at this diminishment as being part of our commiseration with the poor and our commiseration with our ancestors who didn't have very much. Matzah is called lechem oni, the bread of affliction, or perhaps even more literally, the bread of the downtrodden, the bread of the poor. And so we are putting ourselves back into that position. We are becoming slaves, if you will, at this point in the Haggadah, so that we will be able to relive that moment of liberation that is told through the story. Any questions so far? So let's talk about the telling of the story. The telling of the story takes up the lion's share, but you may be surprised to know that when you look back into the Mishnah and even the Talmud, the description of how the story is told is a little sparse. It is certainly not as lengthy as our modern Haggadah makes it out to be. Instead, this is the shorthand explanation. They pour him a second cup, pour, but we're not drinking yet. And there the child asks the parent, and according to the child's understanding, the parent teaches, beginning with shame and concluding with praise, interpreting from Arameo Vedavi, which is my father was a wandering Aramean, until he finishes the entire passage. We're going to look at that passage later. It is a selection that was taken from when people would bring the first fruit offerings to Jerusalem, and it is a relatively short paragraph that summarizes the history of our people through the patriarchs and down into Egypt. So that's the skeleton, which is to say, our children are asking questions. We are teaching according to their understanding, very important, as we'll see. And we start off with that feeling of being lowly, of being in a place of degrading, of degraded life and status because of how we were treated. And then, of course, ending with praise and celebration. That, as you're going to see, is all unpacked in order to make the Magid that we are more familiar with in the modern Haggadah. So we begin with this declaration that this matzah is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and conduct the Seder of Passover. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free people. So for thousands of years, this has been sort of the opening of our tale, where we remind ourselves that the story of affliction is not unique to us, that others may also be suffering and poor, and that the story of affliction is something that should prompt us to action and help, and to make sure that we are feeding those around us, not merely reliving our own story in isolation. And of course, the story is meant to teach us hope. And although we in the 21st century may take the land of Israel and our ability to visit it and be there as free people for granted, for most of the last 2,000 years, that was a miracle that people could not even dare to dream too much. But during the Seder, we would dare to say that, yes, next year we hope that we will be able to be in Israel and celebrate freely. Nowadays, yes, we are able to celebrate freely here in the United States and many other Western nations, but nevertheless, we still say this because that promise of Israel as a symbol of ultimate redemption for the entire world is something that we recognize is still awaiting its full fulfillment. Reminding ourselves that we are slaves is, again, putting us in that right mood, that we are feeling the feeling of our ancestors, we are feeling it personally, we are recognizing, no matter how good our personal situation is, what slavery is like, so that we can have that sense of anticipation and hope for the future. Which brings us then to the 4 questions, or at least what are called the 4 questions. As you can see from this, there's actually only one question. Why is this night different? Or in what ways is this night different from all other nights? That generic question might be the question that a very immature child would ask. Why are we doing this differently? We don't eat like this on Sukkot. We don't eat like this on Rosh Hashanah. We don't eat like this on Shavuot. We don't eat like this on Shabbat. And on all the other holidays, we do not eat like this. This is weird. And it can also be read as, well, I know it's weird, but which ways are going to be weird? And of course, once we know which ways, then we're going to want to know why it's different than those ways. So you can see it's a beautiful way to introduce the idea of questions, to prompt the child to have questions, so that they will ask more than just these points, that a child will see this as priming the pump, that yes, it's okay to ask questions. This is not like when we are in the middle of the sanctuary, you don't get to just jump up and shout out a question in the congregation. That would be considered a bit disruptive. But here at the Seder, the more shouted out questions, the better. Indeed, at many of the Seders that I've conducted at my house for our guests, I will often have rewards for every question asked in order to prompt both children and adults to just realize that questions are the answer. Questions are the doorway to finding out more, and questions are really something that are integral to the Seder experience. So what are the four things that are mentioned? On all of the nights, we eat both chametz and matzah, the leavened bread and unleavened bread. On this night, we eat only matzah. On all other nights, we eat many vegetables. On this night, we specifically eat maror, the bitter herbs. On all other nights, we do not dip vegetables even once. On this night, we dip twice. We've already dipped the first one for the karpas, and we'll dip later on for the bitter herbs. And on all of the nights, we eat sitting and others reclining. On this night, we are all reclining. It is customary to eat while reclining, lounging, if you will. This would have been done on lounge chairs if you were in the Roman time. But even to this day, in our more upright chairs, it is still good to have an extra padding and to make sure, especially when drinking the cups of wine, to lean and recline in the way of free people. This is symbolic of our ability to relax and to enjoy our freedom. And in many ways, it is the antithesis, it's the opposite of the attitude of our ancestors when they sat eating the very first Passover, worried that at any moment something bad might happen, but hoping that at that next moment, the call for liberation would come. Remember, they had their clothes tied, ready to go, staff in hand, sandals on the feet. We get to recline. We are very fortunate. However, and this goes back to your question earlier, Jennifer, those four questions are not the original four questions. If we go back into the Mishnah, it says as follows. And here the son asks his father, but if the son has not got the intelligence to do so, the father teaches him, how different is this night from all other nights? So very clear to us that this is not meant to be just if the kid asks, but you are meant to try and elicit questions from them, and they are not meant to be substitutes for the child's own questions. On all other nights, we eat chametz and matzah, but this night, all of the bread is matzah. Sounds familiar. On all other nights, we eat diverse vegetables, but on this night, only bitter herbs. Sounds familiar. On all other nights, we eat meat, which is roasted, stewed, or boiled, but this night, all of the meat is roasted. That's different. That's not what we normally say nowadays. And on all other nights, we dip our food one time, but on this night, 2 times. That's not what we said. We said that on all other nights, we don't dip at all, but now we are dipping twice. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is this reflected the actual life of the people in the time of the Mishnah, whereas our 4 questions reflects the life of people nowadays. Back then, dipping was more common. As a part of the meal, you would often have a dip that would go along. And indeed, in many Mediterranean cultures, including modern Israeli cuisine, dipping is a very big part of many meals. Also, as we saw in the Torah reading for the Passover sacrifice, they would have eaten the sacrifice with it being roasted and only roasted. We do not have the Passover sacrifice, and therefore the question about roasting the meat would be inapplicable for the modern world. And our own families would never have thought to ask that question because it's not happening. All of the questions are supposed to be about the things that our families are seeing happening. They are not meant to be a set in stone, fossilized from 1,000 years ago. This is what it used to be like. It is supposed to be taking the living, breathing activity of this family meal as its canvas for painting a picture that will cause the family to ask questions and ask more and more and more about Passover and all that it has to teach us. So we have changed this over the years. And indeed, if you only ask 4 questions at your Seder, you're not doing it right. In fact, if you look in the Yerushalmi, they only had 3 questions because of the way that they had handled things. Again, for them, at that point, they weren't dipping at all. Then they dipped twice. The matzah, of course, was the staple, and the meat being roasted was also stable. So different cultures, different communities, different time zones, they have a different set of questions based upon the activities of their house. Now, the Magid begins by reminding us that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be he, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. So, even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt. And everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. So this is the first answer to why are we doing this? God took us out from our slavery. And even though we probably all know that, we mention it multiple times in our prayers each day, still we need to feel it. And we need to feel it especially on the day of Passover itself. So we are doing this in order to feel, not merely to intellectually know. And in fact, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said very famously that even though he was a 70-year-old man, he was still not understanding everything, that he was still learning from his colleagues and from the Passover experience, new and more insights every year. And so no matter how old you are, no matter how many times you've had the Seder, you should still be finding something new each year to learn. And we know from the Haggadah that learning is not something that is one size fits all. In fact, our modern Haggadah tells us that blessed be God who gave the Torah to his people. Blessed be he. The Torah speaks of 4 sons, 4 children, a wise one, a wicked one, a simple one, and one who is not able to ask a question. Now, why are we talking about these 4? To go back to what the Mishnah told us earlier, that when you teach, you have to teach according to the person asking the question. Teaching is not standing in front of a room and reciting a lecture to a group of diverse students, none of whom are allowed to ask questions, and for which your lesson does not apply because they are each learning in a different way. Instead, you have to adjust, adapt, modify, expand, or contract depending upon the student in order to reach each of them in the best way. It gives us this template based off the 4 different times the Torah tells us to teach our children. And it will come to pass when your children will say to you, what is the meaning of this service to you? And you shall say, it is a Passover offering to God. And you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. And you shall be when your son asks you on the morrow, saying, what is this? And you shall say to him, with a strong hand, the Lord took us out of Egypt. Those of you familiar with the traditional Haggadah are probably recognizing some of these questions. And then number 4, when your son asks you on the morrow, saying, what are the testimonies and statutes and laws that the Lord our God has commanded you? And you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. So 3 questions and one teaching without a question matches the idea that there are 3 types of questions, plus one who can't even ask a question. But for all of them, we have to answer in a way that they will understand. Mouse slipped. I'm not putting down which one goes with which, because historically different Haggadahs have actually used different answers for different children. So the answer that might go for the wise child could actually be better given to the wicked child. The answer for the wicked child could be better given to the one who couldn't ask the question. The answers are meant to match the particular person. This is not meant to pigeonhole different people, but instead to demand of a teacher to actually teach the person asking the question. And you will notice that the so-called wicked child is invited to the Seder, is put at the table, and his question is honored. Yes, in our traditional text, it does say that you try to answer him in a way that shakes him to his bones, because you're trying to warn him that his wickedness, his distance from the tradition is going to go badly for him in life. But we are not kicking him out of the room. We are not telling him his question is invalid. We are not saying that he is a permanently irredeemable person. We still are trying to teach him. We are still trying to reach him. Looking at the time, you will find that in the text there is a breakdown of that passages I mentioned. My father was a wandering Aramean, which is from Deuteronomy 26. And what the rabbis do is a standard midrashic technique. Remember midrash back from our third class, where a phrase or a word is then expanded upon and elaborated on. And so on the left, we have the breakdown, and on the right, we have the expansion. And this is a way of showing that even with a short passage, which in the ancient world, most people would have memorized, you can compress a great deal of knowledge and understanding. And this would then allow you to remember the short version and then teach the long version. And to see in that long version, everything from the Passover experience playing out. As you can see, this is definitely the longest section. Now, what I recommend for people that are perhaps not as willing to engage in traditional rabbinic midrashic study is to use that passage on the left and to try and interpret them on your own. When it says with an outstretched arm, what does that mean? When it says with great awe, what does that mean? Just imagine that you are back in your literature class where you are given a poem or given a passage from a famous author, and you need to explore what that was trying to tell you beyond just the technical, literal meaning of the words. It is a great exercise for seeing how well you can retell the story. And part of that story, unfortunately, are the 10 plagues. I say unfortunate because would that the Egyptians had let us leave without any struggle, but unfortunately they refused. And even after 9 of the other plagues, we eventually needed them to realize the suffering that we were enduring through the death of their firstborn. And so during this section, we recount the 10 plagues, and it is customary to take a drop of wine from the cup, the second cup that we still haven't drunk from, and to remove it in order to show that our celebration has been diminished by the plagues that had to be done in order to convince them to let us leave. There is then a section where the different rabbis will explain that the plagues that were done were actually inconsequential to the parting of the sea. What they are trying to say there is not just that they can do math, although the math is pretty impressive, the way they do their one-upsmanship on the calculations, but more that people are often more impressed by the plagues than the great miracle of actual freedom, as symbolized by the parting and crossing of the sea. And we need to make sure that our mind is fixated on that true celebration, the celebration of freedom, not celebrating the destruction of our enemies, because we would rather our enemies repented from what they did and not invite any punishment or destruction, and simply allowed the cause of justice to go forward. In that same vein, we now come to our third discussion of why we're doing all of this. Right? The first one was we were slaves. The second one was that long explanation of the different sections of the Magid as tailored for each of the different children that might be asking questions, or adults. Now we go into a more poetic version, often favorably called Dayenu. Dayenu is usually sung, and it is a poem where each line represents one of the gifts that God had done to us, one of the favors that he had done for us, and it ends with the common refrain, Dayenu. It would have been sufficient for us. And yes, the word Dayenu means all of that. It would have been sufficient for us. Hebrew is a very compact language. And what it is trying to say is that even though I just mentioned that we need to keep our eyes on the final gift that God gave us, the ultimate liberation, really, we would still be wanting to celebrate even if God had only done one of these things. That would have been enough for us to celebrate. If he had just brought us out of Egypt, but not had judgment against the Egyptians, dayenu, it would have been enough, right? We still would be happy, we still would be celebrating. If he had executed judgment against the Egyptians, but not shaming their gods, their idols, dayenu, it would have been enough, and so on and so on and so forth. So the fact that God has done so much more for us means all the more so we need to celebrate. And then we get to our next retelling of why we're doing this time through a more tactical symbology. Rabban Gamliel used to say, anyone who has not discussed these three things on Passover has not fulfilled his duty. Pesach, the Passover offering, and there's a small paragraph describing it. Matzah, the unleavened bread, and again, a small description, and maror, the bitter herbs. If one can point to these three things, which are represented through the Passover meal, and explain why we are doing them, then you have also tapped the essence of the holiday. We are then reminded that we should view ourselves, as we said at the very beginning of the telling, as though we ourselves were brought out of Egypt. Just as we remember ourselves as being slaves, we should remember ourselves as being freed. And so we then celebrate that at this moment by saying that this is an experience that we take personally. So let's sing. And we we sing the first two psalms of what is known as Hallel, and that is Psalms 113 and 114. And I have other recordings if you would like to know some of the ways those can be sung. And then, now with that fullness of moving from slavery to liberation, from degradation to uplift, now we can sing and do the blessing for that second cup of wine, which then leads us into the meal itself. But the meal has certain elements that are more important than others. As much as you're looking forward to getting to that brisket or whatever else is your main course, there are things that have priority. The first thing we have to do then is rachatzah, the washing of our hands with netilat yadayim. This is an actual ritual washing, which goes with the blessing. And we are doing this anytime we eat bread in order to represent our desire for ritual purity before we eat, as though we were at the altar. This is followed by the motzi matzah, the matzah motzi, saying the blessing of the bread over the matzah, and saying the blessing for eating matzah itself. So the motzi we've talked about before, and the blessing for matzah is a standard mitzvah blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah. That God has commanded us to eat matzah, as we saw way back in Exodus 12. Now, matzah is not everybody's favorite food. I know that. Matzah is not easy to eat by itself, but this is not the time to slather various toppings onto it. This is the moment to eat matzah, and in eating it, feel gratitude, to find within yourself that spark of gratefulness to have just this piece of flat, not so tasty bread all by itself, that you need to be able to say thank you for the freedom to be able to eat this and to have this much. You need to find a way to be able to say thank you. And if you can't, then I suggest that you need to dig deeper into yourself and realize that gratitude doesn't come from having everything you want, but gratitude comes from having the bare minimum that you need. And if you can't say thank you for the bare minimum, then unfortunately you will never say a proper thank you, even when you are blessed with riches and far, far beyond that. But you need to be able to say thank you just for this piece of matzah. However, that's not all we eat. We also eat maror, as we said, this bitter herb that would have gone with the matzah. The maror is dipped in charoset, and this ensures, both physically and psychologically, that the bitterness is not overwhelming. Charoset is a mixture of usually apples and wine and cinnamon. There are 1,000 different recipes that are available. I like to put different types of dried fruit in mine, but it is meant to be symbolic of the mud of the ancient world. It is ground into almost a paste, and you dip the bitter herb. Now, the bitter herb really should not be horseradish. And I know that is sacrilege to many of the people who come from Eastern European Ashkenazic communities. And many people in America use horseradish for this purpose. I'm not going to tell you that you cannot, but I will tell you that there are better ways to fulfill this mitzvah, and that the use of horseradish was only because you couldn't do it better if you were living in Lithuania during this time of the year. It really should be an herb. That means a leafy plant. And there are many options that are available. And if you look at the different definitions at the bottom that have been offered by people, technically any bitter leafy plant will be fine. Unfortunately, most of our lettuces have been made unbitter, but you can still find some that are. You can still find endives and dandelion. You can still find things like kale that will be bitter. There are options for what you can get. Rocket also works as another bitter option, although sometimes that is a little bit spicier than bitter. And really what we're going for here is the emotion of bitterness. We are not trying to do a horseradish eating contest to show you how macho I am. This isn't about, like a salsa or chili contest, because pain is different than bitterness. And although we suffered pain as slaves, the big problem that we had was the bitterness, the loss of hope, the feelings of depression, the feeling of lingering misery that comes with bitterness. And that is something that can only be duplicated by eating something that actually is bitter, that makes your mouth just, that makes you feel like you'll never taste anything good again. And that feeling, that emotion of bitterness is what we are trying to recapture so that we can understand what our ancestors lived through and recognize in our own life that even when we're feeling bitter, that it is not permanent, that it is not something which we'll never escape from, that we will be able to find something sweet, that we will be able to find something that will move us past it. Having eaten the maror, this is talking a little bit more about why we have to and why we need to dip it. We then move to Koreich. Koreich is a reminder of when we used to have the full package, meaning the matzah, the bitter herbs, and the meat from the sacrifice, and it would be wrapped together and then touched in the charoset, of course, in order to make sure that it wasn't too bitter. We don't have the meat, so we are literally eating a sandwich that's missing the main point, the main component. This is meant to be a remembrance because nothing tells you what you're missing like eating without it. It'd be like sitting down for Thanksgiving and not having the turkey. Not having the turkey, but still having the rest of the meal is a much sharper reminder about the absence of turkey than sitting down for a meal that isn't Thanksgiving and not having turkey or not having the meal at all. So by deliberately doing the Koreich, we are reminding ourselves that we're still not quite able to have this special meal the way we should. Yes, we've made it this far, and yes, we should rejoice and be happy, but there is a little something missing. And then, now that we have had the symbolic meal and the symbolic food things, now we move on to the actual meal itself. This is dinner being served, matzah ball soup, gefilte fish, all the other things that might go along, the egg, which represents the bonus sacrifice that would be done in the ancient world to make sure that people had extra meat because the Passover lamb might not be enough for everyone. And this would be the proper meal itself. All right, we're going to pause here, and I'm going to have to pick up the rest of this next week. As you can see, there is a lot to say, and we are still going through this lightning fast. This is one reason why the Seder takes longer than people think, and why it's become a routine joke of saying, when do we eat on Passover night? But hopefully you can understand from my own enthusiasm and maybe a few of the things that you've learned tonight, that this is not something to be rushed through. There is so much to enjoy and experience during this time, and I hope that you've learned a lot so far, and we'll continue with the second half of the Seder. Remember, after the meal, you're not done. There's more to be done. We'll continue that at the start of next week's class, and then follow it up with more of how we keep kosher during Passover. But I'll give you a few minutes if people have any questions that they'd like to ask tonight, and I'll be happy to try and answer them today. Just checking the YouTube chat to see if anyone's typing there. Don't see any there, but they're on a bit of a time lag. Anyone on the Zoom want to jump in, or are we good for tonight and you're going to save your questions for next week?
Can I call you tomorrow morning with my specific question?
Absolutely, absolutely. If
Thank
it's
you very
very
much.
specific, if it's very specific and you don't think it would be at all interesting to anyone else, then yes, I'm more than happy to take that as a phone call. And that goes for everybody else, or emails or WhatsApp or whatever your preferred method of communication is. But if it's a question that you think, someone else might want to know this too, it's fine to ask it publicly.
Nope, more specific to me.
No problem. Okay, then we'll leave it here for tonight and this week, and I hope to see everyone again next week. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Shabbat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye. Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye. En el escribir